The wind howl above was a distant, muted roar, like the ocean trapped inside a shell. But down in the earth the air was still and heavy with the scent of damp stone and burning tallow. Ada sat with her back against the curved wall of the dry well, her knees drawn up to her chest, listening to the rhythm of her daughter's breathing in the dark. 6 feet above their heads, a layer of frozen timber, canvas, and 2 feet of hard-packed snow separated them from a world that had tried to erase them. A single drop of condensation gathered on a protruding rock near the ceiling, catching the faint orange glow of their small tin oil lamp before falling silently into the dirt floor. This was their ship, their fortress, their coffin. It all depended on whether the air vent remained clear. Ada checked her pocket watch, the brass cold against her thumb. It was mid-afternoon up there, in the open air where men rode horses and claimed land that wasn't theirs. But down here, time was measured only by the slow burning of oil and the ache in her joints. She closed her eyes, and for a moment the damp walls dissolved, pulling her back to the day the sky had been wide open and cruel. It had started with a piece of paper nailed to a door. The sheriff, a man named Gentry who wore his authority like a heavy coat, had not even looked her in the eye when he delivered the news. The winter of 1888 was already showing its teeth, frosting the windows of the ranch house Ada's husband had built with his own hands before the fever took him. The bank didn't care about fevers or bad harvests, or the fact that a widow and a 7-year-old girl had nowhere else to go. They cared about ledgers. Gentry had given them 3 days to vacate. Ada had stood on the porch, the paper fluttering in the biting wind, looking out at the rolling scrubland that she had fought to tame for 10 years. She didn't cry. Tears were a waste of water, her husband used to say. Instead, she felt a cold, hard knot form in her stomach, a resolve that felt like iron. She looked at the barn, which they would seize. She looked at the house, which they would sell. And then her eyes drifted to the far edge of the property line, near the dried-up creek bed, where the old stone well sat forgotten, a failure from years ago that had never struck water, just a deep, dry throat in the ground. "Mama?" Lottie had asked, tugging on Ada's skirt, her voice trembling with the intuitive fear children have when their parents go silent. "Are we going to town?" Going to town meant the poorhouse. It meant separation. It meant the end of them as a family. Ada looked down at Lottie, whose face was pale and pinched by the cold. She smoothed the girl's hair, her hands rough from work, but gentle in their touch. "No, Lottie," Ada had whispered, the plan already forming, desperate and terrifying in her mind. "We aren't going to town. We're going to play a game. A very quiet, very long game of hide and seek." The lie tasted like copper in her mouth, but it was necessary. The world wanted them gone, swept away like dust. But Ada was not dust. She was the stone that broke the plow. She walked to the edge of the well, peered into the darkness, and saw not an empty hole, but a chance. The transition from the open air to the underground had to be surgical. They couldn't be seen leaving, and they couldn't be seen staying. For 2 nights, while the house still legally belonged to them, Ada worked under the cover of a moonless sky. She moved like a thief on her own land. The well was 5 feet across and 12 feet deep, lined with rough limestone that had held against the earth's pressure for a decade. It was dry as a bone, the bottom filled with tumbleweeds and drifted sand. The first task was clearing it. Ada lowered herself down on a rope, her boots scraping the walls, and spent hours filling buckets with debris that she hauled up and scattered far into the brush so no pile would give them away. Her shoulders burned, the muscles screaming in protest, but fear was a potent fuel. Every time she felt exhaustion threatening to collapse her, she looked at the lit window of the ranch house where Lottie slept, unaware that her mother was carving out a tomb to save her life. The roof was the hardest part. It had to be strong enough to hold the weight of winter snow, yet low profile enough to be invisible from 10 paces away. Ada scavenged the heavy beams from the back of the collapsing curing shed, dragging them one by one across the frozen grass. She laid them across the mouth of the well, spacing them carefully. Over the timber she stretched a heavy tarred canvas she had stolen from the barn's supply loft, the only thing she effectively stole from the bank, though she reckoned they owed her much more. On top of the canvas she shoveled dirt, packing it down, smoothing it to match the surrounding terrain. She left a trap door, a small square barely big enough for her shoulders, hinged with leather straps and disguised with a glued layer of rocks and dead grass. It was heavy, awkward, and dangerous. If it jammed, they would die. If it broke, the snow would bury them. But as she stood back, panting, her breath pluming in the icy air, the well was gone. The ground looked unbroken. They moved in the night before the deadline. They took only what mattered and what kept them alive. No furniture, no heirlooms, just blankets, the heavy buffalo robe, the tin of oil, the dried beef, the sack of flour, and the small iron pot. Lottie carried her rag doll, clutching it to her chest as if it were a talisman. Ada carried the rifle and the water skins. Descending into the well for the final time felt like stepping off the edge of the world. Ada lowered Lottie first, securing the rope around the girl's waist. "Be brave," she had whispered. "It's just a fortress, like in the stories." Lottie's eyes were wide, reflecting the starlight, but she nodded, descending into the gloom without a sound. When Ada followed, pulling the trapdoor shut above them, the darkness was absolute. The click of the latch was the loudest sound in the world. They were buried. They were alive. The first week was a lesson in the physics of suffocation and the chemistry of heat. Ada knew that without fire, the cold of the earth would seep into their bones and kill them in their sleep. But fire meant smoke, and smoke meant discovery. She had anticipated this. Before sealing the roof, she had dug a narrow trench sideways from the top of the well, running a rusted stovepipe out into the hollow trunk of a dead cottonwood tree 5 yards away. It was a risk, a desperate bit of engineering. If the smoke was too thick, it would pour out of the tree like a signal fire. They had to burn clean. Ada taught Lottie the discipline of the flame immediately. "We only burn the driest twigs," Ada explained, her voice low and even, the lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the limestone walls. "And only at night, when the dark hides the smoke." They established a rhythm, a holy order to their confinement. The space was small, a cylinder of existence where every inch had to be justified. The bedding was rolled against one wall during the day to create floor space. The food was stored in a hollowed-out niche in the stone, high up to keep it away from dampness and insects. The latrine bucket was a source of constant shame and logistical nightmare. It had to be sealed tight and emptied only on the darkest nights, the contents buried far away in the scrub. The air in the well grew stale quickly, heavy with the smell of their bodies and the faint, oily tang of the lamp. Ada watched Lottie closely for signs of sickness. The girl was resilient, but the lack of sunlight turned her skin the color of parchment. To combat the claustrophobia, Ada invented tasks. They counted the stones in the wall, 412 in the bottom 3 rows. They braided and unbraided the fringe of the buffalo robe. Ada taught Lottie arithmetic using dried beans, whispering the equations. "If we have 10 strips of beef, and we eat half a strip a day, how many days?" Lottie would frown, her small brow furrowing in the dim light. 20 days, Mama." "Good," Ada would say, though the answer made her own stomach clench. 20 days was nothing. Winter lasted months. The silence was the third resident of the well. It was a heavy, pressing thing. Above, the wind might be screaming, but down here the earth swallowed the noise, leaving only a dull vibration. They learned to communicate in whispers, terrified that a loud voice might somehow vibrate through the ground and alert a passerby. They became mice, scurrying in the dark, surviving on crumbs and caution. The psychological strain arrived not with a bang, but with the slow, dripping erosion of patience. By the third week, the novelty of the fortress had worn off for Lottie. The dampness made everything feel clammy. The clothes they wore were never truly dry. Lottie began to fidget, her small body yearning for the ability to run, to jump, to see the horizon. She would stand under the trapdoor, staring up at the cracks of light that seeped through during the day, her hand reaching up but never touching the wood. "Can I go out, just for a minute?" she would ask, her voice thin and whining. Ada had to be the wall. She had to be harder than the stone around them. "No," she would say, without anger, but without room for argument. "Mr. Gentry is out there. The wolf is out there. We stay in the burrow." It broke Ada's heart to see the light go out of Lottie's eyes, to see the dull acceptance replace the spark of childhood. To counter it, Ada began to tell stories. Not the fairy tales from books, but stories of their ancestors. Women who crossed oceans, men who built cabins in the snow, people who endured. She turned their suffering into a narrative of strength. "We are waiting for the sun," Ada would whisper as they huddled together for warmth. "The sun is gathering its strength, just like us. And when we come out, we will be stronger than the town, stronger than the bank." She stroked Lottie's hair, praying the lie would hold, praying the food would last, praying the heavy snowpacking above them wouldn't crush the timber beams that groaned under the weight. Then came the day the vibration changed. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic thudding, deep and resonant, traveling through the earth and into their spines. Horses. Not one, but several. Ada froze, her hand instantly clamping over the flame of the lamp, plunging them into total darkness. She reached out and found Lottie in the blackness, pulling the girl tight against her chest, her hand covering Lottie's mouth. The thudding grew louder, closer. They were right on top of them. The ground shook. Dust sifted down from the ceiling, landing on their faces like dry rain. Lottie whimpered against Ada's palm, a tiny sound that felt like a scream in the silence. Above them, the muffled sound of voices drifted down, distorted by the earth but unmistakable. "Checking the perimeter. Feels hollow here." A pause. The creak of leather saddles. The heavy step of a boot hitting the ground right next to the trap door. Ada stopped breathing. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she feared the men above could feel it through the soles of their boots. If the dog was with them, Gentry's black hound, they were dead. The animal would smell the vent, smell the unwashed humanity rising from the earth. Ada gripped the handle of the knife at her belt, a futile gesture, but instinctual. She visualized the trap door being ripped open, the blinding white light, the barrel of a gun. She tightened her hold on Lottie, ready to shield her with her own body. The boot scraped across the hidden door, shifting the dirt. A heavy pause stretched into an eternity. "Just adrift," another voice called out, distant. "Wind piles it up against the old creek bed. Moving on." The boot stepped away. The saddle leather creaked again. The thudding of hooves resumed, slow at first, then fading into the distance. Ada didn't move. She didn't let Lottie go. They sat in the pitch black for an hour, the dust settling on their skin, the terror slowly receding into a trembling relief. They were ghosts. They were invisible. But they were also trapped, and the world above was walking right over their heads. When Ada finally relit the lamp, her hands were shaking so badly she dropped the match twice. The flame flared to life, illuminating Lottie's tear-streaked face. "Did the wolf go away?" Lottie whispered. Ada nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She looked at the ceiling, at the heavy timber beams. They were safe for now, but the winter was only just beginning, and the supplies in the niche were already looking smaller. Ada realized then that the cold and the dark were not their only enemies. The greatest threat was the wait. The endless, grinding wait for a spring that might never come. She pulled the buffalo robe tighter around them. "Let's count the stones again, Lottie," she said softly. "Start from the bottom." The air grew heavy in the weeks following the close call, but it was not the weight of the sheriff's boots that threatened them now. It was the weight of the invisible. Ada noticed it first in the flame of the oil lamp. It had ceased to dance. Instead, the small orange tongue stood perfectly still, shrinking inward, turning a sickly blue at its base. Lottie was sleeping more, her breathing shallow and rapid, and when she woke, she moved through the molasses of a headache that made her whimper when she turned her head. Ada felt it too, a dull, throbbing pressure behind her eyes, a lethargy that made lifting a hand feel like hoisting a sack of grain. It was the vent. The heavy snowfall from the previous night must have shifted, or perhaps a layer of ice had crusted over the hollow cottonwood trunk that served as their lung. They were slowly suffocating in their own exhaled breath. The realization hit Ada with the force of a physical blow, snapping her out of the stupor. If the lamp went out, it meant the oxygen was gone, and they would simply drift into a sleep from which there was no waking. She looked at Lottie, curled in a tight ball under the buffalo robe, and knew she had to climb. Climbing the walls of the well was not like climbing a ladder. The footholds were uneven, jutting stones slick with condensation, and the cold had stiffened Ada's joints into rusted hinges. She extinguished the lamp to save the last precious dregs of good air, plunging the well into absolute, suffocating blackness. She had to move by touch alone. Her fingers scrabbled against the limestone, finding the familiar grooves she had memorized during the construction. Every pull upward was a battle against gravity and the dizzying effects of the bad air. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. 10 feet up. 11. Her head bumped against the rough timber of the roof. She reached out, feeling for the base of the stovepipe where it angled into the earth. It was cold. Freezing cold. She disconnected the pipe with trembling hands, a shower of soot falling onto her face, invisible in the dark but tasting of ash. She pushed her arm into the horizontal tunnel she had dug, reaching toward the tree stump. Her fingers brushed against a solid wall of packed ice and debris. It was blocked. Panic flared, hot and bright. She had no tools up here, only her hands. She dug her fingernails into the blockage, clawing at the frozen earth and ice, tearing her skin, ignoring the pain. She needed to break the seal. She struck it with the heel of her hand, once, twice, a desperate, silent hammering. Suddenly the plug gave way. A rush of air, shockingly cold and smelling of pine and clean snow, blasted into the tunnel. Ada gasped, filling her lungs with the freezing draft, her head spinning with the sudden influx of oxygen. Below her, in the dark, she heard Lottie stir and cough. The air was flowing again. The lung was clear. By late January, the cold had become a living thing, a predator that lived in the stone walls and waited for the fire to die. The wood supply was critical. They had burned every scrap of debris from the well bottom, every twig Ada had stored in the niche. Now they were burning the handle of the shovel, feeding it into the small stove in slivers. Lottie's fever came in the night, a radiant heat radiating from her small body that seemed to mock the freezing air around them. She thrashed under the blankets, muttering about the creek, about the horses, about things that weren't there. Ada held a cup of snowmelt to the girl's cracked lips, but Lottie turned her head away, her eyes glassy and unseeing. The terror of the illness was worse than the terror of the sheriff. Gentry could only kill them. The fever could take Lottie and leave Ada alive in this hole, a fate far worse. Ada checked the niche. The medicine bottle, a brown glass vial of laudanum and willow bark tincture, was empty. She had used the last drop weeks ago for a toothache. She needed heat. She needed to break the fever. But the stove was cold and the darkness was absolute. Ada made a decision that felt like madness. She would not go to town. That was suicide. But she remembered the fence line, the old cedar posts that marked the boundary of the grazing pasture half a mile west. Cedar burned hot. Cedar burned fast. It was a risk of exposure, a risk of leaving Lottie alone, but the alternative was watching the cold stop her daughter's heart. "I will be right back," Ada whispered to the delirious child, tucking the robe tight around her. "I'm going to catch the sun for you." She ascended the wall, her movements practiced and efficient now. Pushing open the trap door required a heave of her shoulders that made her vision blur. She emerged into a world that was blindingly white, lit by a full moon that turned the snow into a sheet of silver. The wind cut through her threadbare coat like a razor. She stayed low, crawling on her belly across the snow crust, mimicking the shape of a grazing animal. Every shadow looked like a man. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a voice. She reached the fence line, her hands numb, and began to work the first post loose. The ground was frozen iron. She had to kick the post, rocking it back and forth, the sound echoing dangerously in the crisp air. Finally, it snapped. She dragged it back, a 4-foot length of seasoned cedar, leaving a trail in the snow that she would have to cover before dawn. The return journey was a blur of adrenaline and freezing pain. When she dropped back into the well, pulling the trapdoor shut, the silence of the earth rushed back to meet her. She shaved the cedar with her knife, her hands shaking, and struck a match. The fire caught. The smell of burning cedar, sharp, aromatic, smelling of home, filled the well. The temperature rose, degree by agonizing degree. Lottie stopped shivering. Ada sat by the stove, watching the flames, clutching the knife, waiting for the dawn that she could not see. February was the month of the void. Time dissolved. There was no morning, no evening, only the periods of sleep and the periods of waiting. The food rationing had become a brutal mathematics. A strip of dried beef was divided into 3 pieces, one for Lottie, one for Ada, one for the future. They were always hungry. It was a hunger that moved past pain into a strange, hollow clarity. Ada found herself staring at the limestone wall for hours, tracing the fossilized shapes of ancient shells, imagining the ocean that had once covered this land. If the fish could survive the pressure of the deep, she reasoned, she could survive the pressure of the earth. Lottie had stopped asking about the outside. She had stopped playing with the beans. She lay most of the day, conserving energy, her eyes tracking the movement of the shadows as the sun moved across the ventilation holes far above. They had become creatures of hibernation, their heartbeats slowing, their needs reducing to the barest essentials. To keep their minds from atrophy, Ada began to teach Lottie the layout of the ranch from memory. Not the ranch as it was, but as it would be. "Close your eyes," Ada would say, her voice raspy from disuse. "Walk out the front door. Turn left. What do you see?" Lottie would whisper, "The big oak tree." "No," Ada would correct gently. "The oak tree is gone. We planted an orchard there. Apples. Red ones." They built a kingdom in the dark, planting crops that would never grow, building fences that would never need mending. It was a shared hallucination, a way to impose order on a chaotic universe. But the silence was eroding them. One day, Ada heard a voice that wasn't Lottie's. It was her husband's voice, clear as a bell, calling her name from the top of the well. "Ada, bring the water." She stood up, her heart leaping, before reality crashed back down. There was no one, just the wind whistling through the vent. She bit her lip until it bled, the sharp pain grounding her. "We are here," she said aloud, her voice fierce in the small space. "We are still here." She forced Lottie to sit up, forced her to drink the last of the murky water. "Count the stones," she commanded. "Count them loud." Lottie's voice was thin, a reed in the wind. 1, 2, 3. The numbers were the only truth left. The thaw arrived not with warmth, but with sound. It began as a rhythmic ticking, like a clock counting down, then accelerated into a steady, persistent dripping. The snow above, layers deep and packed hard, was turning to water. The earth, frozen for months, could not absorb it fast enough. The well, designed to hold water, remembered its purpose. The floor of their home turned to mud, then to slush. Ada woke to the sensation of cold water soaking into her socks. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. If the water rose too high, they would be forced up toward the trap door, up toward the daylight and the danger. They began to stack. Everything that mattered, the bedding, the last scrap of food, the tin box of seeds, was moved to the highest niches or piled onto the unstable structure of the stove. They lived perched on the remaining stones like birds in a flooding nest. The dampness was pervasive. It seeped into their clothes, their hair, their skin. The smell was of wet earth and rotting canvas. But the melt meant something else. The road was open. The silence from above changed character. The crisp, lonely whistle of the winter wind was replaced by the softer, wetter sounds of spring. Mud sucked at hooves. Wagons creaked. Ada heard the town coming back to life. She heard a wagon pass nearby, the driver shouting at his mules. "Ground's soft as puddin'," a man yelled. "Bank ain't going to get a crop out of this mud pit this year." Ada held her breath, her hand gripping Lottie's shoulder. The bank. They were talking about the land as if it were dead, as if it were a failed asset. They didn't know the heart of the ranch was beating 6 feet beneath them. The water rose to their ankles, freezing and black. They stood on the piled stones for 2 days, unable to sit, huddled together for warmth, waiting for the water table to balance. It was the final test. The winter had tried to freeze them, the hunger had tried to hollow them, and now the earth tried to drown them. But the water stopped rising, inches below the firebox of the stove. It held there, shivering with the vibrations of the passing world, before slowly, agonizingly, beginning to recede. Emergence was not a triumph of trumpets. It was a blinding, painful birth. The water had drained enough to leave a floor of slick mud, but the supplies were gone. The oil was gone. The food was dust. It was time. Ada waited for the moonless phase, just as she had when they entered. She pushed the trap door up. The seal of mud and grass cracked, showering them with dirt. The air that rushed in was sweet, smelling of wet sage and new grass. It was intoxicating. Ada climbed out first, her muscles trembling, her body light and strange after months of confinement. She pulled Lottie up after her. The girl looked like a specter, pale and thin, her eyes vast in her face. They stood on the edge of the well, shivering in the cool spring night. The ranch house was dark, its windows like empty eyes. The barn was half collapsed under the snow load. The land looked scarred, chewed up by the winter. They did not go to the house. It was not theirs anymore. The ledger said so. But the ledger did not know they existed. Ada took Lottie's hand, feeling the small, bird-like bones beneath the skin. They walked past the house, past the empty corral, toward the timberline where the wildlands began. They had survived the erasure. They were no longer the widow and the orphan who could be bullied by a sheriff or evicted by a banker. They were something else now, creatures of the earth, tempered by the dark, carrying the winter inside them like a weapon. Ada looked back once at the well, the hidden mouth that had swallowed them and spat them out alive. It was just a hole in the ground again. She turned her face toward the mountains, where the snow was still deep, but the air was free. "Walk, Lottie," she said, her voice quiet and steady, the voice of the narrator who has reached the end of the chapter, but not the book. "We have a long way to go, but the ground is under our feet." They walked into the shadows of the trees, leaving no tracks on the hard-packed mud that the sun would bake into stone by morning.